basically, these pilots or these investments provide a foundation or a ground layer for the Nature Smart Cities project to test and validate the business model that is under development. And this testing has been ongoing already. And here to share the results of this testing with us is Maira, Finizola and Silva from the University of Antwerp, who has been researching the various ecosystem services and benefits coming from the pilots. And we would like to hear more about this. Please, again, feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A to Maira. And after her presentation, she will also be joined by Kris Verheyen, a professor of the Ghent University, who was also involved in this work, so they can happily answer all your questions. Maira, please show us the way in the wonderful world of ecosystem services.
Of course, thank you for the introduction. So if everything's okay, you can see my screen. Right.
All good.
Okay, so I will present the business model pilot testing. Let me just, next slide. As Vito mentioned in his presentation, introducing the business model, a key component of our Nature Smart Cities business model is the fact that it is designed and created in collaboration with local authorities in a 2Cs area. So while these local authorities contributed to the conceptual development of this business model, their incredibly valuable pilot cases contributed to the testing this reasoning and validating the steps in the multi-criteria analysis that we envisioned. So what specifically is the role of this pilot testing, and consequently, what does this session contribute to the webinar? First of all, being able to test the concept that Vito has explained on real-life examples taught us many valuable lessons about possibilities and feasibility. So it helps to shape this conceptual idea into an applicable step-by-step workflow. Though applying our multi-criteria approach on the different pilot cases, we again gain new insights to refine the final product of our business model, which Vito will present later on. More, it contributed to distinguishing between methods and answering questions like which methods are feasible for local authorities and how can we obtain reliable results without extensive input from the user. An important element of any tool is the fact that it is reliable and accurate by cross-validating the business model results with results from applied scientific studies. We aim to deliver just that. So, one of the key objectives of the Nature Smart Cities business model is to demonstrate the impact of green infrastructure. This is of vital importance that communicating these results is done in a clear and easy interpretable manner. In what follows, I will introduce you some of the pilot testing results. Also, these results are quite similar to the results that you can obtain from using the business model in the future. So it provides a great example for what is feasible by applying the business model to your case in your municipality. So we've already explained a bit about ecosystem services. I will shortly repeat, since I will be talking a lot about ecosystem services. So ecosystem services are the benefits people obtain from ecosystems, so in this case, green infrastructure. So this scheme clearly illustrates the ecosystem services we focus on. Nevertheless, there are also other ecosystem services which are not on this scheme, and sometimes names might differ. So for every ecosystem service I will discuss in this presentation, I will shortly explain what the ecosystem service entails and how the impact was measured. So the Nature Smart Cities projects works with 7 city partners, and some city partners have multiple pilot projects. This means that a lot of research needed to be done. Therefore, Nature Smart City called upon many master students to use this opportunity to write an interesting and useful dissertation about one or more pilot projects under the supervision of Ghent University or the University of Antwerp. So in general, the students compared a gray or a before scenario and a greener scenario to determine the impact of green infrastructure on the ecosystem services. In other words, which benefits can be created by implementing more green infrastructure. So since our time is limited, I will focus on 5 pilot projects and 7 ecosystem services. So at the beginning of the project, the local authorities chose which ecosystem services they wanted to focus on, as you can see on this table. Since I don't have the time to go over all the results, I will discuss 2 pilot projects for every ecosystem service, beginning with water retention and infiltration. So for this ecosystem service, I will look into the case of Antwerp Zuidrand and The Hague, and I will firstly short explain what water retention and infiltration actually refers to. So these 2 rather small pictures illustrate what happened with precipitation in a green or gray scenario. So the picture on the left shows a gray scenario with a lot of impermeable surface, meaning that rainwater often flows to the sewage system. Whereas on the right side, you see a green scenario with a lot of nature and this permeable surface, meaning that a lot of rainfall infiltrates the soil and is kept out of the sewage system. So in other words, green elements have the capacity to absorb and infiltrate precipitation. This is beneficial for several reasons. First, surface runoff is reduced, thereby lowering flood risk, which is especially relevant in light of the increasing extreme weather events. Secondly, replenishing groundwater levels, which is also very important during dry periods. Lastly, captured rainwater can be reused for multiple purposes, such as irrigation. So the more water is absorbed by nature, the less runoff will go to the sewage system, which actually saves us money. So how do we calculate the amount of stormwater runoff retained by nature? So we first needed to know how much green infrastructure was implemented and which kind of infrastructure. Then by using the retention coefficient, this coefficient denotes how much of the precipitation is retained by green infrastructure, we could calculate the avoided runoff. By means of an example, when it rains in an area with mostly grassland, 78% of the rainfall is retained by the green infrastructure, and the other 22% will flow away, often to the sewage system. Another example, whereas it rains above a pond or a lake, almost all water will be retained if the capacity is big enough. So no water runoff will go to the sewage system. So the first case, the The Hague case, the Convid Park, we calculated the avoided runoff for the before and the after scenario. In the after scenario, the impermeable surface did not really decrease, but there was a lot of new green infrastructure and more diversity. Moreover, an urban water buffer was added. So we calculated for the gray scenario that there was an avoided runoff of 10,700 cubic meters a year, which is more or less 55% of the total amount of rainfall that falls in the park. Whereas in the green scenario, it would be 11,200 cubic meters a year, which is more or less 58% of the total amount of rainfall on the project area. This is a small difference. However, this value did not include the urban water buffer. So this means that almost all precipitation that falls into the park or is absorbed by nature or will flow to the urban water buffer. So since the vegetation in the after scenario can reduce runoff with more or less 11,200 cubic meters, the urban water buffer will store the remaining 8,133 cubic meters of rainfall in the urban water buffer. But since the urban water buffer has a capacity of 35,000 cubic meters, runoff from adjacent streets and roofs is also collected in the urban water buffer. So the difference between the gray and the green scenario is more or less 35,500 cubic meters of runoff each year that is collected or in the urban water buffer or absorbed by nature. This is not 1, not 2, not 3, but 14 Olympic swimming pools of avoided runoff each year. So for the second pilot case, I will go to the Antwerp Zuidrand or the Contig case, which had an old railway verge, which is now transformed to a blue-green park track. So we calculated that in the before scenario, 25,400 cubic meters of rainfall a year was absorbed by nature. This is more or less of the total amount of rainfall. In the aftermath, this did decrease a little bit to 23,800, which is 88% of the annual rainfall. But again, this does not give a full view of the case, since there is also a natural water basin of 4,000 with a capacity of 4,300 cubic meters, meaning that the rain that is not absorbed by nature will flow to the urban water, to the natural water basin. Furthermore, runoff from adjacent streets will also flow to the natural water basin. So it has the potential to reduce the runoff with more than 10,000 cubic meters a year, but it also depends of the evaporation and how much water will infiltrate the soil from the natural water basin. Again, the difference between the gray and the green scenario is this 8,700 cubic meters of avoided runoff each year, which is 3.5 Olympic swimming pools. So regarding this next ecosystem service, microclimate regulation, I will discuss the Capella case and Southend. So the ecosystem service microclimate regulation refers to the local cooling effect of green infrastructure. Research has shown a rise in urban temperatures, which has a negative impact on human health. Furthermore, it's often associated with the urban heat island effect, a phenomenon in which urban space exhibits higher temperatures than surrounding unurbanized areas due to the combination of huge amounts of paved surfaces, low evaporation, and low ventilation. Green infrastructure, on the other hand, has been identified as an effective strategy to moderate the negative effects of urban warming through shading, evaporation, cooling, and the modification of airflows. But this is a difficult ecosystem service to actually quantify. So we use a method by Zittler et al. This method calculates the difference in temperature in a certain region with and without green infrastructure. More specific, by dividing the project area in circles of 30 meters and comparing the percentage of paved surface with the percentage of green coverage, we could calculate a temperature difference. So for the Capella case, was found that there was an average of 0.15 degrees Celsius cooler than the reference point outside the project area. This can be explained also because Wemeldingen North, or Capella, is close to the seaside, which is already cooler than other regions. Nevertheless, the calculations also show a temperature reduction of 0.24 degrees Celsius in the after scenario. Of course, this seems like a very small change, but we can't forget that the cooling effect might increase with the growth of the trees. Another side note I want to make is that there is also a lot of private property and gardens, which the municipality, of course, needs to work around. So this next illustration demonstrates the before and the after scenario, as you can see on the top two pictures. And the bottom two pictures demonstrate a minimum and a maximum cooling effect that can be achieved. In the minimum cooling scenario, on the left side, demonstrates what would happen if all public space would be gray infrastructure. And on the right side, you will see what would happen if all public place was green infrastructure. So the darker red the circles are, it refers to a heating effect, whereas the dark blue circles refer to a cooling effect. The next case I will discuss is the new business park innovation center named Launchpad, situated on Southend-on-Sea. So as you can see on the image, which is a view from above, in the gray scenario, you had a lot of grassland and impermeable surface, whereas the new scenario, you had a lot of trees added, but also hedges, middle green, flower fields, and impermeable surface. Calculations showed that there was no difference in temperature with outside the project area. However, in the green scenario, a temperature decrease of 0.666 degrees Celsius could be achieved. To put this number into perspective, An average temperature change of 0.66 degrees is an equivalent to the average global temperature increase from the beginning of the 80s up till now. So while the average values that are calculated might seem negligible on paper, it will definitely have a considerable impact on local heat stress relief on hot summer days. Then carbon sequestration. We'll discuss the case of Bruges and Capella. Carbon sequestration is a process by which atmospheric carbon dioxide is taken up by trees, grass, and other plants, do photosynthesis and stored as carbon in biomass and soils. So more green infrastructure means more carbon sequestration. Carbon sequestration is estimated based on the size and the species of woody vegetation, as well as their growth patterns. Furthermore, the below-ground carbon stock was estimated based on soil samples and literature study. Under the supervision of Ghent University, some students engaged in field measurements to gather the necessary data. So again, the Capella case, the calculations showed that there was a small difference between the gray and the green scenario. So as you can see on the graph, by 2060, there would be a difference of 37 tons of carbon or 135 tons of carbon dioxide between the before and the after scenario. It is also important to notice that the share of carbon sequestered by trees is smaller in the after scenario than in the green scenario. This can be explained by the fact that a lot of older and bigger trees will need to be removed to make place for new infrastructure, but a lot of new smaller trees will be planted, but it takes time to actually have the same carbon sequestration as the bigger, older trees. So the difference between the gray and the green scenario is about 135 tons of carbon dioxide in the year 2060. So to put this into perspective, carbon emission of 20% of the households in the project area will be sequestered by 2060. In other words, carbon pollution of 1 in 5 households in Wemeldingen North will be neutralized by new green infrastructure in the year 2060. The second case I would like to discuss is Wijnpark ten Boomgaarde in Bruges. As you can see on the figures, the before scenario was already quite green with grass and trees, but the after scenario, the water stream was opened up and a lot of new trees, tall grass and flower fields were added. In general, the calculations shows that there is a decrease in carbon sequestration, but this can again be explained. So when looking at the different habitat types, we again see that the share of carbon sequestration by trees decreases significantly. This is because 60 trees needed to be removed to open up the water stream, and 80 new trees have been planted, yet it takes a lot of time to actually replace the bigger trees. So we discussed this case also to show that trade-offs are inevitable. Although the carbon sequestration in the first 40 years will be less than in the before scenario, improvements in habitat for biodiversity that are created are huge. I will show you the next slides. So as I said before, trade-offs are inevitable, but at least with our tool, these trade-offs are clear and understandable, which can help local authorities to make informed decisions. This brings us to the Habitat for Biodiversity ecosystem service. So decades of research have shown that biodiversity plays a vital role in ecosystem functioning, and that processes such as capturing essential resources, producing biomass, and recycling nutrients are all impaired as biodiversity declines. Furthermore, biodiversity not only underpins ecosystem functioning, it also enables these processes to be resilient in the face of global change. So vegetated green infrastructure features can improve and expand habitat for a wide variety of fauna and flora, which results in more biodiversity. So in our research, we will focus on 4 taxonomic groups: birds, bees, butterflies, and amphibians, by means of 2 methods. Firstly, the average structural diversity. This method is not used to calculate species diversity, but diversity in vegetation structure. So the more vegetation structure, the higher the probability of more biodiversity. Secondly, potential habitat for targeted species. This method is based on the natural elements that different species need to survive in urban areas. The presence of those natural elements will determine whether a species is likely to appear in that area or not. So the more beneficial natural elements that are presented in a certain area, the more likely the area will become a potential habitat for that species. To come back to the Bruges case, as I mentioned before, the variation in green infrastructure has increased significantly. This is also translated in the average structural diversity score, which increased from 2.9 on a scale of 6 to 4.6 on a scale of 6. This is, in other words, a 60% improvement of vegetation diversity. This graph denotes the potential habitat for targeted species. For each biodiversity group, we see that there is a significant increase. The vertical axis denotes that the percentage of species that likes or dislikes a certain habitat, and the colors denotes the suitability of the habitat. So by instance, amphibians, we see that 50% of the amphibian species find it a suitable habitat, whereas the other 50% believe that it's not a suitable habitat at all. But in the green scenario, 50% of the amphibian species find it a very suitable habitat, 40% find it a suitable habitat, and 10% find it a moderate potential habitats. So thus, although carbon sequestration, as I discussed earlier, did not improve that much, at least not in the first couple of years, habitat for biodiversity has undergone a complete transformation. For every biodiversity group, significant improvements are achieved. So the Antwerp-Zuidrand or Contig case. Again, the Contig case in the after scenario contains a lot more of green infrastructure diversity than the before scenario. This is also reflected in the average structural diversity score. It's changed from 1.9 on a scale of 7 to 4.5 on a scale of 7. So these changes in green infrastructure, means that an average structural diversity increased with 142%. This graph denotes again the potential habitat for targeted species. These figures show that even though the forest zone did decrease, there is still progress in terms of potential habitat for all taxonomic groups. As you can see, the biggest improvement is achieved for bees and amphibians, but even for birds and butterflies, the situation will improve. This brings me to the last ecosystem services I want to discuss, the cultural ecosystem services. Cultural ecosystem services are the non-material benefits people obtain from nature. They include recreation, aesthetic enjoyment, physical and mental health benefits, and so on. They also contribute to a sense of place, foster social cohesion, and are essential for human health and well-being. Although everyone benefits from cultural ecosystem services, their impact on urban life is mostly intangible, and as a result, difficult to measure and quantify. However, cultural ecosystem services are directly experienced and intuitively understood by people who come into contact with nature. We aim to measure this ecosystem service by means of a survey, but this was possible for the Contig case, but not for the case of Den Haag. Due to multiple reasons, such as the COVID pandemic and the postponement of the opening of the park, it was not possible to conduct a survey. Nevertheless, the literature study demonstrates the significance of cultural ecosystem services. In the gray scenario, he found that there was a limited variation in vegetation. Furthermore, there were a lot of fences surrounding the park, which negatively influences the accessibility and connectivity of the park with the neighborhood. In addition, there were no kinds of educational projects to raise awareness. Whereas in the after scenario, there was a lot of focus on improving the neighborhood and its living environment. It was also deliberately chosen to work in close collaboration with the neighborhood to fulfill their needs and make the Convid Park the heart of the area. The reconstructions also ensured an attractive and pleasant place where people could meet. and interact. Furthermore, the facilities such as playgrounds and sport areas were renewed. Also, the fences were removed and new walking ways were implemented, which improved connectivity and accessibility. Lastly, also multiple educational projects were implemented, which focused on climate adaptation, water storage, irrigation, and the functioning of green and blue infrastructure. For the last case, the Antwerp Zuidrand, one student did a survey involving 283 people, and the survey demonstrated that although most people already felt safe in the before scenario, the perception of neighborhood safety in the after scenario did improve, especially for people with young children. Also, regarding the indicator perceived quality of urban green space, almost all respondents felt like they have been made multiple improvements. Since the renewal, 25% of the respondents visits the site more often than before, and more respondents enjoy it in comparison to the before scenario. The survey also demonstrated that 50% of respondents visit the place to get a peace of mind and to enjoy nature. Lastly, the survey showed that a quarter does visit the park more often, but it did not cause people to go outside more often. So people might have changed might not have changed the regularity of engaging in physical activity, but they did change the location. Lastly, the indicator for social cohesion, the results show that the majority of people don't really engage in social activity because they came alone or with someone from the same households. But this can also be explained by the COVID pandemic. However, the survey results demonstrated that making contact with strangers did seem easier after the renewal. Half of the respondents felt like a tight community in the park since the renewal, and social inclusion was also often mentioned by respondents, since the park had possibilities for all age groups, as well as children and people with disabilities. So with this business model, we really try to visualize the results in an understandable way, as we try to realize with this small graph and also the other graphs that I have already shown. So in the next presentation, Wito will explain how the business model actually works, which information you need to fill it in, and which output you can expect. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for this overview, Maira. And Kris, I would like to invite you to join us on the screen as well. And again, a reminder to the audience, if you have any questions to Maira and or Kris about what you've just heard about the testing of the different ecosystem services impact of the pilots, please drop them in the Q&A. Maira, Kris, having listened to your presentation, it is clear that you've been able to identify impacts of various sizes on a whole range of ecosystem services in the different pilots. At the same time, probably the context and the local setting of each pilot is very different, and this has an effect on the kind of impact that you find on ecosystem services. To what extent does the research that you have done allow you to aggregate quantified statements about impact on a wider diversity of similar settings, or is this very tailor-made type of research? How do you interpret this? Maybe Kris, could you have a first go?
Yeah, thanks, Tako, for your question. Well, it's indeed important to take a step-by-step approach. And what we mean by that is that you first identify for the particular case, what are now the key ecosystem services here that are at play. And then you go to the next step and try to quantify them. And just doing this in a very systematic way is really important. And that's also what we did actually in this testing phase. So the first step we took was to ask indeed municipalities, what services do you consider as important here? And for instance, the audience may have noted that in The Hague, we, for instance, did not quantify the carbon sequestration because for the municipality, this was not really of interest there. So this first identification step is really an important one.
And this is one that you do, I interpret from what you were saying, on the one hand, perhaps based on expected areas of most significant impact, but maybe also on the policy or the political landscape. Where is the biggest political interest, and what could be the main driver for decision making? Is that right? Is this, Maira, how we can interpret this kind of results as an input for the business model?
Yeah, sure. I totally agree with what Kris said. We really try to take a step-by-step approach and look at every case, very focus on every case in particular. So,
right, thank you. Maybe on one very specific ecosystem service, we picked up a question from the audience a bit earlier on that may be relevant to put to you both. In this wider basket of cultural ecosystem services, the physical and mental health aspect is mentioned. And we had a question from Jonathan Taylor, who was wondering to what extent, from your experience in this tool and in this research, the actual mental well-being benefits can really be pointed out and maybe even quantified. Maira, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so as I showed in one of my first slides, mental and physical health is indeed included in our business model. In the business model itself, we don't focus on one ecosystem more than the other, but when you are using the tool, you can actually choose to really focus on, for example, that ecosystem service. So we really try to give a full view of every ecosystem service. Of course, now we will enter a testing phase to see if every ecosystem service is as good presented as we hope it is. So we will see, but it is certainly included in our business model.
Right. And does this, Kris, mean that you, for instance, if there's a very strong and specific interest in mental health in a certain local authority, you could also zoom in on that particular level, or would it always be part of this bigger picture of, let's say, the cultural benefits as you presented in the current analysis?
Especially these cultural services are not that easy to quantify. In that
Right.
sense, the biophysical services are a bit more straightforward also, but I have to say that still serious thinking has to be done before coming up with numbers there. But yeah, for these cultural services, really to quantify them, very often this survey approach is needed, as also explained by Maira. And mostly you also then capture multiple values at the same time. So yeah, it requires good thinking and again, a good strategy to really quantify this very well. Right.
But at least you've been able to develop an initial approach for that and be able to run these kinds of surveys on site. So there's the beginning of the answer. I would like to take another question from the audience, which comes from Johan Asselbergs, which is related to the carbon sequestration benefit. And his question is, the carbon sequestrations are only calculated by trees. So when trees are removed, there you have this setback, but then of course you refer to other types of vegetation that still sequester carbon. The question is, do you also include other, let's say, capturing mechanisms such as soil and water or other ecotopes that might also capture carbon?
Yes, they are actually included. So it's not only about the trees here. So the trees are indeed an important stock of above ground carbon, but we also included I have to admit, simple method to quantify the uptake of carbon in the soil, in the grassy areas or in the semi-paved areas. So that's included. And in the graphs that Maira showed, this was also part of the this was part of the graph, and this is and can be an important component indeed.
Right. And speaking of these carbon sequestration benefits, it was clear from Maira's presentation that there's this long-term perspective needs to be taken in some cases where you may have to take a step back or plant new trees that only yield this sequestration benefit in the longer term. So Maira, how do you think you could sort of capture this as a message also to the decision makers in terms of who will benefit from this investment. It will not be the people living and enjoying the space today, potentially, but it will be in the future. And how can you translate these future benefits into, for instance, financing? Is there a way for you to do this also in your analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. So for some ecosystem services, indeed, the benefits will be later on, but there are other ecosystem services where the benefits are immediate, and we really try to monetize these benefits in our business model. But you can also look at your benefits in like 5 years or 10 years, but even for 40 or 60 years. So it really depends on which time scale the local authority is thinking about. But of course, if you engage in projects like this, you need to be aware that you need to have a long time vision. So
right. So that's this long-term perspective that our panel members earlier spoke about as well. If it's sometimes difficult to develop it, at least the business model will provide some tooling for informing and quantifying those kinds of decisions as well. I'm looking to see if there's any further questions from the audience. It doesn't seem to be the case. Maybe just one last question, and maybe it's a bit of a tricky question or a mean question even. You could argue that, and I think Maira did in her presentation also, that for one ecosystem service, the jump in benefit is much smaller than for the other. Do you think that at some point in time, there will be a sort of a top 10 or a prioritization listing of the most important ecosystem services that can be improved by urban green infrastructures, or will this always be a case-by-case basis with a totally different order per city? Kris, what do you think?
I'm tempted to go for your second scenario. So and personally, I also think it's really important that we do a true case-by-case tailored made analysis, because one of the points that Phil also raised in the very beginning of the seminar was that trust is important, and translation to a local context is really important. And by taking this step-by-step approach and really doing a tailor-made analysis, I think this will raise the level of confidence in what you're doing. And it could well be that indeed, like for instance, urban heat island and so on, will be key ecosystem services for the future in most cases or in many cases. But in a different context, it can also be, like we talked about a lot about water. That's certainly not always relevant or as relevant, but so it can still vary. But yeah, just again, I want to stress this tailor-made approach and not to kind of automatically quantify this and this and this, and then we are done. So really apply it to the specific case.
Okay, thanks very much. I think this is a clear message, and it also clarifies and justifies why such a broad scope of ecosystem services needs to be in the picture throughout the analysis. I would like to thank you both for your contributions and your explanations, Kris and Maira.